Hi, my name is Haley, and Brooke will be joining us later, but we are presenting the article, It's Time to Be Scientific About Dyslexia. So before we jump into the main ideas about this article, I want us to reflect on our prior knowledge about dyslexia. I'm going to play a video that played a pretty big role in how I defined dyslexia up until recently. This is a Disney Channel commercial where Bella Thorne explains her challenges with dyslexia. I'll go ahead and play the video, and when it's done, I'll pause it so we can have a class discussion about how we define dyslexia before reading the article. But before I play the video, I want to apologize for the poor quality. The editing software that we're using kind of messes up the video quality, but the audio should be okay.
My name is Bella Thorne, and this is the story of the time I found out I have dyslexia. I remember when I started first grade. Right away, it was awful because I couldn't read as well as the other kids. My brain mixed up letters like B and D and M and W. Dyslexia is different for everyone who has it. For me, it just makes it harder to read or write. I started working really hard on how to read better. My family helped me by making me read everything, from menus to cereal boxes to road signs. Today, I read a year above my grade level, and I learned to face problems, not run away from them. Dyslexia makes things hard for me, but not impossible.
You just watched a TTI on Disney Channel.
I remember thinking this commercial was so inspirational as a kid. I was like, wow, Bella Thorne, look at you overcoming dyslexia. And now I realize just how cheesy it is. But we'll go ahead and pause this video and take some time to discuss, and then we'll continue on. All right, now that we've activated our prior knowledge, we're going to jump into how the article defines dyslexia. It highlights 4 different understandings of the term, and the first is using dyslexia as a synonym for a reading disability. This description believes that poor readers who struggle with decoding, and as a result struggle with comprehension, could be labeled as dyslexic. This understanding assesses students by giving them word reading tests. So this might look like running records, MISCU analysis, the San Diego Quick Assessment, or really any other reading assessments that we've been learning about in our program. These tests help find the readers who consistently struggle to decode words accurately and or fluently. The downside to this definition, though, is that there's no clear cutoff between normal and disabled reading performance. That being said, there may need to be boundaries that are set to distinguish between moderate and severe dyslexia. This cutoff would need to be flexible to take into account testing errors. So, for example, if a student has testing anxiety and they perform lower than their actual abilities, there will need to be flexibility. The second definition is dyslexia as a clinically derived subgroup of poor decoders. So, this understanding believes that dyslexia pertains to a smaller subgroup of students within the big pool of struggling readers. So, for example, if you have maybe a group of 5 struggling readers, maybe one of those students is in the subgroup of struggling readers that has dyslexia. They believe that those with dyslexia have severe decoding problems, and the individuals are assessed based on a doctor's judgment. It may include psychological examinations done to observe educational, cognitive, and neuropsychological factors. For example, they may conduct IQ tests, which actually have been proven not very reliable. Or similarly to Dyslexia 1, they may conduct word reading tests. The problem with this definition is that there is no scientific or research-based way to separate those with dyslexia from those who just have reading and decoding difficulties. There also is no specialized instruction or resources for those with dyslexia compared to those who just struggle with decoding. The third definition is dyslexia as a persistent intractability to high-quality education. This basically means that any students who receive reading intervention and afterwards still have persistent reading struggles should be labeled as dyslexic. To assess students based on this criteria, we would have to look at their response to instruction and intervention over a period of time rather than making a diagnosis on the basis of the student's initial performance on a cognitive test. The problem with this method is that it's not clear how long we'd have to observe students' performance to determine if they are dyslexic or not. We could only make a diagnosis after a long period of high quality intervention, in other words, one-on-one intervention, which would be expensive and unrealistic to provide every student with. This diagnosis also could be detrimental to students' self-esteem because it encourages the idea that if you're labeled as dyslexic, it's unlikely that you're going to make significant progress in your reading skills. The final definition is dyslexia as a neurodiverse profile. This understanding is pretty unique in that it revolves less around reading abilities and more around individuals with cognitive difficulties. So, cognitive difficulties may involve working memory, processing speed, attention, time management, and so on. They believe that dyslexia goes beyond reading difficulties and that you can struggle with dyslexia even if you're a strong reader. This assessment is similar to Dyslexia 2 because it uses clinical diagnosis. They conduct cognitive and neuropsychological tests, and the results are used to help individuals obtain accommodations and resources. The problem with this description is that there's no evidence that the cognitive interventions are effective, and everyone has cognitive strengths and weaknesses, so it may not be very reliable. It also seems unfair that those who are strong readers may be provided with accommodations and modifications. Meanwhile, we have struggling readers who are not diagnosed and they don't have access to the same opportunities or resources. I'm going to hand it over to Brooke to talk about why there are differences among the definitions and why people are even still arguing for the use of the term dyslexia.
Okay, so now we are going to go over why there are discrepancies with the definitions that Haley just went over. And the problem that the authors were finding is that science is being trusted over research done in the field of reading difficulties, and we are ignoring misrepresentations or refutations of current research. And as a result of that, all of the different definitions and practices exclude huge numbers of struggling readers, and therefore, struggling readers are not receiving the same benefits that those that are labeled as dyslexic are receiving. Now we are going to get into some of the common arguments against replacing the term dyslexia with the term reading disability. And the authors looked at 3 different categories for this. And the first one was the impacts of genetics, neuroscience, and cognitive science. And each category had an argument that they made, and authors found a problem with the argument that these research professionals made. So the first one was that there are multiple findings in genetics, neuroscience, and cognitive science that have legitimized maintaining a dyslexia and poor reader distinction. But the problem with that argument is there is little support for neuropsychological assessments that assist in screening for dyslexia, and there is no criteria for those assessments that clearly distinguishes dyslexia from poor readers. The second category that the authors looked at was personal empowerment and exculpation. And the argument they made here was that a dyslexia diagnosis can help struggling readers feel better about themselves, and a dyslexia diagnosis assures that students are not seen as stupid or lazy. And in other words, the problem is not their fault. But when we say those things, we forget to think about how students with reading disabilities who do not have a dyslexia diagnosis are not stupid or lazy either. And we don't want this to be made out that they are. And students without a diagnosis are not to blame for their difficulties either. The third and final category they looked at was how conceptual problems are not unique. And the argument they made was that conceptual and diagnostic challenges that come with dyslexia are equally just as challenging for others with developmental disorders. But the problem with that argument is there are educational inequalities and inequities that could negatively impact a student's life if they do not receive an appropriate diagnosis. And at the end of the day, we want all students to receive the proper accommodations, modifications, and help to ensure their learning is progressing. And we're doing everything we can as teachers to ensure that students are learning to the best of their abilities. And I do think it's important to mention here that these arguments that were made by research professionals, but at the conclusion of this article, the authors described and went over how they found all of these problems with the arguments. So therefore, they think they should replace the term dyslexia with reading disability. But none of the research professionals who made these arguments thought so. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Haley, and she is going to discuss how society is convinced that the term dyslexia is useful and relevant.
All right, so before we start talking about this, I'm just going to do a quick recap of what we've learned. So far we've learned that there are several differing definitions of what exactly dyslexia is, and we've also learned that although the term dyslexia has had proven problems with it, there are still groups of people that argue it should be used within education and our everyday lives. So continuing on this idea of the groups that believe it should still be used, we're going to talk about what's called fallacies of relevance. So, fallacies of relevance are arguments that are made that are not based on a sound or relevant line of reasoning. So, there was 4 fallacies of relevance that were talked about in this article, and the first of which is called the straw man and ad hominem. So, this term for arguments is where individuals provide misleading information so others tear it down to support the cause. So, for example, someone could state that dyslexia simply does not exist. Well, obviously, this is going to be easy to be torn down by the public because there are students who struggle with reading disabilities, and these are real distress that students experience. So, saying that it doesn't exist is going to get people worked up to defend the term dyslexia. Another example would be saying that parents use the label dyslexia to excuse their lazy and less than bright children. Obviously, this is going to get people frustrated, and they're going to fight back saying that no, students with reading disabilities or students with dyslexia have reading disabilities that they're born with, and it's not because of their parents. So it's going to lead people to want to use the term dyslexia so that the blame is not put on the parents. The next fallacy of relevance is called ad verecundium. I hope I said that right. And these are personal testimonies from well-known celebrities or people with status. So for example, I showed the Bella Thorne video, and when we hear Bella Thorne talking about her struggle with dyslexia, we're more willing to believe that information because she is someone with status. Whereas if your neighbor is maybe talking about it, that their child has dyslexia, you may not be as willing to support the term. But when it's someone important, like a celebrity or the president or whoever it may be, you're more likely to accept the term dyslexia. The third one is ad populum, and this is a group mindset. And it's basically if everyone thinks that something is correct, then it must be true. So, for example, if there's a big group of people that believe dyslexia is a diagnosis that needs to be recognized within students, then it must be true. The final is just ignorance. So, this is the idea that dyslexia should be considered true because it actually hasn't been proven false yet. So they believe that in the future, there might be a clear distinction between dyslexic students and struggling readers. So until that point, we need to keep using the term dyslexia because it hasn't been proven false yet. So hopefully this makes a little sense of how people are arguing for the term dyslexia and why this term is still so relevant within our everyday lives. I'm going to hand it back over to Brooke now.
Okay, so now we are going to look at why we are studying dyslexia. And the reason this applies to us is because we need to educate ourselves about the different definitions and arguments so that we feel confident to be able to identify reading problems and intervene appropriately. We also need to understand the impacts of those different definitions on our students because some of those definitions are not backed by research and others are more catered to different social, racial, and economic groups. We also need to ensure that we advocate for our students because all struggling readers should be identified and provided with appropriate intervention and accommodations. And after reading this article, the big question we have for ourselves is how do I apply this to my teaching? And again, we need to accommodate students who do have a dyslexia diagnosis or students that we identify as struggling readers because they all deserve the help and assistance from us so they are learning and progressing in that learning. And then when I think of dyslexia, I think back to my junior field experience that I had last semester. One of the students in the classroom had a 504 plan for dyslexia. And so what that looked like for her was it listed different accommodations, such as not asking her to read aloud, providing different books on audio, and grading her written assignments on the content only, not on the spelling. 504 plans look different for every student, but that is what hers listed for that teacher. And then we also ultimately we need to help students love literacy and provide all the proper scaffolding to ensure our students are receiving an appropriate education. Okay, so now, what are your thoughts? After reading this article and watching the video at the beginning of our presentation, how would you describe dyslexia? How have your thoughts changed since you have read this article? And we will pause and talk about that in our groups. Online students can think about that and possibly write about that in the discussion post. And we will also wrap up our presentation with the discussion of that question. But here is the reference page, which includes the reference for the article that we read. Thanks for watching.